Well, I'm really honored to be here and looking forward to our conversation after my talk. So the period of the late 1990s through the early 21st century was one of intense interest in archives on the part of institutions, governments, curators, and artists. The allure of the archive, as archivist Sue Breckel notes, was sparked by a heightened engagement with memory and the emergence of memory technologies, such as databases, hard drives, and centralized server systems. The drive to digitize meant that some records would be left behind, fueling concerns about inclusion and who should have the right to choose which materials would be digitized. The massive production of online material seemed to be a gift for some towards a universal human memory, and to others, like new media theorist Janina Hoth, quote, "The more absolute knowledge on the internet becomes, the harder it is to comprehend as knowledge transforms into an unreadable amount of data," end of quote. Most postmodernist thinkers had challenged the authoritative nature of historical records and archives, in part instigated by Michel Foucault's 1969, going back a bit, discussion of archives as a demonstration of relationships and institutions in process, perpetually incomplete repositories that represent power through what is present and absent in their contents. And Jacques Derrida, in Archive Fever, a Freudian impression, argued for the political nature of the archive, observing that power resides in control over its content and access. Anticipating the rise of the internet and digital preservation, he astutely described a contemporary obsession with archives and the desire to preserve. He painted a tension between the public domain and personal memory. Materials that play out today, for example, in debates about the right to be forgotten, the argument that an individual should be able to have their records removed from social media and other internet sites, or the ways that social media intermingle personal and institutional commentary and politics, well, we're living through that, or the growing interface between personal health data collection and medical records. In an archival impulse in 2004, Hal Foster named the archival turn, one that has continued to this day, although it was, some thought, temporarily exhausted, but certainly revitalized by COVID and advanced AI and machine learning technologies. And with markers of this interest, such as the 2015 Venice Biennale, All the World's Futures, created by the late Akwi and Wezer, with numerous artworks and installations drawn from historical collections and archives. Foster described three categories of artist works, and you always have to be anxious about taxonomies, but I'm still going to use these, that I think retain pertinence in relation to digital archives. Those that use archival content, so my historic video works remixed and replayed archival footage, or where more recently artists have been invited into archives by archivists. Those where the artist performs methods from archival practices, so collecting, describing, cataloging, ordering, even playing the persona of the archivist, and those in which artists create unique archives. Really powerful works have occurred when archivists invite artists into collections to create new interpretations. And I'm going to stray from the digital and use a couple of examples of material work. The Artist in Residency program at the City of Portland Archives and Record Center supported Portland Archives Artists in Residence, and this was a public art project, which I think is very interesting, supported by the 1% for public art. So Garrick Imatini and Kaya Sand, who interviewed selected subjects who were documented in a really comprehensive police bureau surveillance process. So fonds of 576 activists, many of them anti-nuclear activists and many feminist activists, augmenting police fonds with, quote, lives embedded yet silenced in the records, unquote. And this resulted both in very powerful artworks, and these are some really incredibly poetic prints and poems that Sand created. So very powerful artworks, but also a new understanding of that history and the expungement of the criminal records of those surveyed. So very interesting to see this kind of relationship around an artistic intervention and an archive and real significant transformation. And originally unintentional artist's archive is the Singapore Art Archive Project, first initiated as a personal collection by artist Ko Nuagang in the 1980s. And then it combines over 1 million pieces of ephemera and articles from the art world, his own painting and documentation of life in Singapore, documents related to arts policies, very controversial, given censorship in Singapore. And these he has, because it was not accepted as an archive by the official archives for a long time, he stacked these and reordered them in his apartment and used his apartment as a sort of archive and exhibition space. We saw some of that earlier with our colleagues who are here from Israel. And now the collection is actually formalized as an archive and is selectively digitized. An example of an artist performing the role of an archivist and creating a unique archive that has moved from physical to digital is Antonio Montadas' The File Room, an emulation and critique of archival practices and an archive in its own right. It's a project intentionally without an ending, a traveling installation of physical archival files in a connected and collectively created and ongoing database of instances of censorship, political, cultural, and scientific. Montadas opened it in 1994, and the database was hosted over the years at several sites, becoming the archive of archives, with a network to other institutions and their documentation regarding censorship. The file room eventually migrated to Rhizome, who upgraded and restored it for exhibition in 2016 at Rhizome's affiliate, the New Museum, and has ensured its online presence. Further, in the digital archive, where objects are represented through three-dimensional scanning and documents and photographs digitized and described, and where standard navigation and interfaces are used, such as access to memory, ATOM, which is very good at showing archival context, not the world context of an object, but its kind of position within an archive in its hierarchy, and very poor at rich media display, and collective access, which is the opposite, very good at rich media display, but poor at archival context. The performance is one between the archivist and the technology, as Jane Birkin notes, quote, "In art and in the archive, though, chance events materialize, resulting in a hybridity between human and system that can be seen in all levels of archival description even today, as well as in other information management systems generally," and I end the quote. And this has been a bit of a theme today, but with the emergence of image recognition systems that rely on the database of human tagging histories and the tensions between human activity, the archivist or other engaged with the archives, tagging objects, and the machine, so that tension is amplified and misrecognition becomes a site of intervention. So, we have to really remember that with deep learning, AI is trained on lots and lots of human data, so all the biases kind of reoccur. Hence, Cathy Desbiens de Mule, who is a Canadian media artist who's working out of Lisbon these days and a former journalist, uses machine learning to critique the exploitive practices behind the process of training learning algorithms, sampling indiscriminately between large-scale databases and online archives such as the New York Times and associated metadata. Her series, I like a lot of her work, but her series, I'm Not a Robot, attacks crowdsourced data labeling techniques, a practice at the base of machine learning, which she argues resides on free labor, ours, that increases the wealth of a few individuals. The artist inputs thousands of images of cats into an AI model that was trained to identify cars. So this tongue-in-cheek experiment resulted in absurd-looking creatures, which are neither cat nor car, yet somehow are both at once. And Desbiens de Mule then created a simulation of the CAPTCHA challenge, so she's critiquing CAPTCHA in this whole thing, that asks users to identify either cats or cars over and over and over. So we have this new hybrid of cat car. The new media art, or born digital, world has been obsessed with the challenge of archiving as media and platforms constantly change, and museums and archives are at loss as how to manage materials, which Giselle Biegelman enchantedly describes as museums of losses for clouds of oblivion. She says, how to deal in the field of preservation and conservation with files that disappear, works that stop functioning, services that vanish from one day to the next. Unquote. And the larger problem, succinctly stated by Oliver Grau, Janina Hoth, and Evelyn von Goit, is, quote, these artworks challenge traditional archive, collection, and preservation methods, and consequently, museums and other memory institutions, both online and offline, will struggle with archiving this art of our time for future generations, unquote. The Refresh conferences, which began at the Banff New Media Institute when I was still there, continue, as well as significant archival projects, most notably the Archive of Digital Arts, which we'll come back to later, and Rhizome. I know that Michael Connor of Rhizome spoke yesterday, and I hope not to repeat, but Rhizome's relaunch of Artbase in 2021, which began in 1999 and now holds 2,200 artworks, is organized through linked open data. Rhizome acknowledged, quote, and this is so important, it comes back to what I said earlier, but technical infrastructure shapes the way in which knowledge about cultural heritage is created and captured, organized, and shared. With born digital archives, there is a need for software infrastructure that can model artifacts as assemblages, reflecting the relational and dynamic qualities of born digital cultural expression, end quote. And further Rhizome's design allows interoperability between discrete archives, a topic we will return to, very important and very difficult. Rhizome encourages artists and curators to choose the manner that works will be reproduced. I think you probably did hear about this. So held on the original technology, migrating processes between equipment, emulation of systems, and updating of the work's source code. So I want to now discuss two historical digital archives, and Jennifer did an incredible job earlier today talking about the BNMI, so I'm going to try and I'm going to skip over some stuff here. But they represent the keen interest in archives as places of creative practice, so the Banff New Media Institute's archive and the Daniel Langlois Foundation's archive. Both archives are the products of transitory but significant initiatives in the media arts and digital media context. Both suffered unanticipated project endings due to institutional and human agency, and now are in varying stages of recovery and rediscovery. So Sue Brakall suggests, quote, that records do not simply go through a life cycle from creation and currency through into inactivity, but in fact, in the archive, they move in and out of currency, and I think that's one of our grand challenges. So in the instances of the BNMI and the Daniel Langlois Foundation, disappearance meant the removal from public access, but these archives also faced digital obsolescence in aspects of the collections once they were pulled out. Media artworks and internet art rely on connections to databases, links, and third-party servers and services, and moreover, many works are interactive and contributor-driven, so there's no easy beginning and end, and often exist in many versions. So the challenge of disappearance is a classic one for digital humanities projects, and archiving and legacy discoverability strategies really need to be baked in. We can talk about that in the discussion. I'm not going to go into that whole thing. So the BNMI ran from 1995 to 2010 at the Banff Centre, and we heard about it was on the heels of the Centre's early history of virtual reality and new media research. It was an international think tank on the present and future practices of new media, with leaders engaged in developing the science and technologies, creative and design practices, jurisprudence, business models and theories, and it was a training hub and business incubator with 3 research labs and a co-production program. So BNMI staff curated exhibitions and events both at the Walter Phillips Gallery on site and to some extent abroad. We talked about that earlier. And over the course of its first 10 years, it held over 150 summits, symposia, workshops, conferences, and events, all of which were recorded and from which relevant records, release forms, agendas, analyses of events, and other memorabilia were kept. Co-productions were described and cataloged, and the descriptions, documentation made available online, as were exhibition descriptions and documentation. We created horizonzero.ca, a Heritage Canada funded experimental online gallery, and a site for discourse regarding the new media world, which acted as a guide back to the summits and co-productions. Susan Kennard and I were very attentive to gender imbalance in the growth of the new media industry. The presence of female-identified creative practitioners and their lack of inclusion in festivals, and the burgeoning of a diverse global creative new media community, strongly representative of Asia, Latin America, Africa, Europe, after the fall of the wall, as well as the US, the UK, and, to be expected, Europe. As much as possible, there was mitigation against digital exclusion to avoid, as George Gardner has so aptly described, in quotes, symbolic annihilation, where absence from the historical record removes practices and voices that could shape the future, a concept applied to archives by Michelle Caswell, and we just heard about her in the last presentation. A feature, and we'll come back to her. So a feature of the BNMI was its deep commitment to Indigenous creators and technical leaders whose practices and self-governed events were supported by the Institute, and I really underscore self-governed there, such as Drumbeat to Drum Bites, 2 gatherings regarding Indigenous practices and presence on the internet that were 2 decades apart and were led by Hasu, Beskaga, and Iskew. Indigenous artists, technicians, theorists, curators, and elders engaged in all manner of BNMI activities, and we also built collaborations with local Indigenous communities. Despite its government and industry funding, the BNMI fearlessly hosted agonistic debates over video game sexism, algorithmic bias, anthropocentric notions of intelligence, open source versus copyright, bioengineering and environment, and other controversial topics. In sync with Foucault, Derrida, and Foster's calls to re-examine the archives, the BNMI held summits and workshops that considered the transition to digital archives. Events debated memory and history, the archive versus the database and their ultimate integration, and the question of what should be digitized and how conserved, with titles such as Media, Material and Culture, Communicating Canada's Heritage, and Unforgiving Memory, and Refresh. These raised the archive fever temperature within the BNMI, and the belief that we needed to leave a record of this complex era. Sorry. I'm just kind of taking you through images that are sort of parallel to the conversation of the era. There we go. So that intuition is rewarded today as the BNMI funds include documentation of pressing debates that are in contemporary reprise, the nature of social media, gender and race bias in AI systems, deep learning agencies, the mapping potential of GPS and GIS technologies, and control over data, and also virtual reality, which some people think was born 4 years ago, which I find so interesting, and engage deeply diverse actors regarding technology, systems, tools, and creative expressions that have shaped our lives today. So for the archive project, a decade of audio recordings and documents were digitized and brought up to 2005 standards, and a physical archive and finding aid was created by a professional archivist who we seconded from the National Archives of Canada. There was an online interface which was searchable by events, names, and dates, and it was easily accessible on the Banff Centre's website, as were the co-production catalogs. I left the Centre in 2005, and Susan Kennard, then director of the BNMI, left in 2010. The Banff Centre closed the BNMI shortly afterwards, but the digital archive persisted, available on the main website, and was well used. Dr. Sara Cook and I edited the book, Euphoria and Dystopia, the Banff New Media Institute Dialogues, and it was published in 2011 by the Banff Centre and University of Waterloo's Riverside Press. Each entry in the ebook version in 2013 was linked to the online archive as a thematic, discursive, and critical finding aid. So we had this idea of the book as a kind of finding aid to the archive. In 2016, Indigenous artist Cheryl Randell found that the archive was no longer accessible and sounded an alert. It had been removed after a change of leadership at the Banff Centre and a web rebranding, and would never return to its original online form, thus severing all of the links made to several thousand digital records and to the digital archives from other publications, either Horizon Zero or Euphoria and Dystopia, and of course the Finding Aid. 2 years later, the Banff Centre did not renew the horizonzero.ca domain, so this legacy of the BNMI also disappeared. So for many years, contributors to the archive, most poignantly Indigenous artists and historians and other scholars and archivists, the book's publisher, Philip Beasley, Sara Cook, and I appealed to the Banff Centre to return the archive to researchers and the public. And then Jennifer also joined the campaign, again through a digital interface, and volunteered to contribute funding. So it's a long story. I'm not going to go on and on about it. But the good news is that the new archivist, Jessica Zimmerman, has reached out now with a commitment to find a home for the BNMI story, integrated into the Banff Centre's history and timeline, and revitalizing its online presence, including the audio recordings in some form, although the interface and finding aids can't be salvaged. So demand for access to the archive has grown. So that thing I said earlier about how archives, their interest and their relevance are not limited to a period of time. And the Banff Centre hopes to revitalize its digital programs and celebrate its 50 years of work with Indigenous communities. So it's a good news story, but we'll see what happens. So the Daniel Langlois Documentation Center was initiated in 1998 by Jean Gagnon and the co-founder of Soft Image, and it became a very important repository for new media artworks funded by the foundation and an expanded place to collect archives from artists, institutions, and events representing the history of media arts. Langlois renovated the ex-centrist buildings, which included theaters, gathering spaces, and a home for the Documentation Center's materials, and offices for visiting researchers. The DLF bought collections, including those of senior video artists, such as the Vasulkas, the EAT, Experimental Art and Technology collection, which Jennifer spoke about, the 9 Evenings of Theater and Engineering. A robust web presence accompanied the center. Let me just find that, allowing users to identify artists and projects. And in 2005, the Documentation and Conservation of Media Arts Heritage, DOCAM Network, was founded, led by Alain de Picard, and comprised 20 institutions, from universities to New Media Journal Leonardo to digital media centers and museums, with funding from SSHRC. It sought to create standards for the documentation, exhibition, and archiving of new media artworks. And DOCAM and the Education Center invited artists, curators, and historians into this rich collection through a series of residencies. So, for example, in her residency, Dr. Carolyn Landrill produced Shifting Polarities, Proposing a Canon of Canadian Electronic Media Art, 1970 to 1990, which is an influential treatise that made the case that the contemporary art canon must expand to integrate new media. All media art, not just new media art, but media art. So Langlois was, here's the Vasulka archives, and DOCAM. Langlois was hard hit by the 2008 financial crash, and Gagnon left in 2008 as well. Access to the Documentation Center ended with the collection boxed up and stored. Ultimately, though, contractual obligations with individuals or agents who had donated the records, i.e. they had to find a home for these archives, the Langlois did. User activism and the committed actions of Jean Gagnon resulted in a safe landing for the archive as La Cinémathèque Québécoise accepted the funds. Gagnon moved to the CQ as head of collections in 2010, and the DLF collection remains one of the CQ's most popular archives. Langlois recently, Danielle Langlois, recently subsidized, hold on, let me just open this. Hey, it worked, hoorah. Recently subsidized the conversion of elements of the collection through emulation, including works with online links from Flash to HTML, HTML5, as many artist websites and related CD-ROM and DVD projects were built in Flash. Some of you may be old enough to remember Flash, in the early 2000s. So this is the site, and then on this site you can actually go to the original website, and I'm going to talk about interfaces soon, but it's got some nice capacity here, and you can kind of make your way through it, and you can see the publications, the specific collections, and the highlights. So really, really worth exploring. So I've primarily discussed examples and practices embedded in the art world, but critical engagement with archives has really amplified significantly in the last decade, well beyond the art world, and has included many professional archivists and communities and individuals, including those seeking restitution and repatriation. So critical, and by the way, I really loved the Things in Time archival presentation. So, it's in this space. So forgive me, I'm going to repeat some of what was articulately said recently. So critical archival studies seeks to build archival practices that resist reinforcing oppression based on race, class, gender, sexuality, and ability. Instead, the goal is to develop inclusive, accessible, multivocal sites for cultural participation and dissemination, associated with an ethics of care and commitment to expand representation, involve donors and community members in the description and exhibition of their archival materials, and to shape the way that records are understood. So reevaluation and reinterpretation of the content of archives and their histories of collection is, of course, a principal theme in this. And as Michelle Caswell, who's also a proponent of community archives, has stated, and I quote, "Given the long trajectory of archival use in which remnants of the past are preserved in the present for use in the future, the symbolic annihilation marginalized communities face in the archives has far-reaching consequences for both how communities see themselves and how history is written for decades to come." And I just want to reinforce that this challenge is not just about absence, it's about presence. So in terms of presence, these calls for interventions intersect with over a decade of activism on the part of scholars engaged with Indigenous communities and Indigenous peoples and communities themselves who are fighting for decolonization and reconciliation, such as Sam Frederick, Julia Riddell in Canada, Sharon Farnell and the team at Alberta Archives, Trish Luker, Susan McCamish in Australia, and there's a host of others. So according to S.R. Carroll and her research team, and I quote, "Indigenous data must facilitate collective benefit for Indigenous people to achieve inclusive development and innovation, improve governance and citizen engagement, and realize equitable outcomes." And I end the quote. So Call 70 of Canada's Truth and Reconciliation Commission requires the inclusion of Indigenous record keepers and researchers, their perspectives and methodologies within the Canadian archival system. And there has been response. So the Association of Canadian Archivists created new protocols based on OCAD principles of Indigenous ownership and control. And this includes replevin, or repatriating holdings to Indigenous groups at their request, or the renegotiation of ownership and access with Indigenous peoples for archives remaining in collections. And very much associated with the growth of machine learning analytic tools is the concept of care, which argues for the need to protect Indigenous rights and interests in Indigenous data, including traditional knowledges, balancing these rights in relation to open data and the growing use of machine learning. Indigenous activists have been joined by anti-Black racism researchers such as Andrea Fatona, feminists such as Diagnosio and Klein, and those engaged with GBLTQ2+ collections such as Kara Knights, whose questions have initiated fruitful reevaluations of archives, their histories of collection and provenance. So the archival, so I want to move on to talk about archival interfaces, in part in this context. So while appearing to be disembodied, archives contain lived experiences and actual bodies. This is embodied, lived experience represented in archives, even if they appear to be documents. And interfaces need to be understood as dynamic and lively to be effective. So the archival interface can also be seen as an artifact of exclusionary practices rather than technological design. So the things we need to start to design for are interfaces that allow a close reading of the history of specific archives and fonds within the context of nation states and global patterns, such as migration, through structural analyses of collections, collecting practices and gaps, and visualization is an incredibly powerful tool for this, as well as attention to and through linguistic analyses of metadata. So interventions include rethinking attribution and provenance, metadata and description modification workshops, and refinements even at the item level and subject heading modification. So this is a really exciting context for artists to make artwork in. And, you know, in conversation with archives and archivists, you want to retain that historical record so you understand that history of collection, including racism, bias, etc., and then you want to comment on it. So it's a very complex process to work with archives in doing this reworking in a proper way. So 20 years ago, as institutions began to choose which records would be digitized and which remain analog, Margaret Hestrom challenged the role of the archivist in interface design in a very prescient essay. She was driven by the need to share appraisal criteria and the ways that record hierarchies are constructed and contextual information regarding objects in the collection. As she said, quote, such traces of self-conscious archival activities should provide a lens through which users could read and interpret the evidence left behind. In other words, the archivist is not truly objective. The archivist leaves a trace. So this is what she's speaking to. And she asked, should we create highly structured interfaces that incorporate the archivist's best judgment about how to exploit a collection, or should we encourage users to explore it intuitively or randomly? How much power and control do we want users to enjoy? How much power do we as archivists wish to share? Should our interfaces reinforce archivist perspectives on what constitutes an archive? Or should we enable users to construct their own notions of archives based on the needs or values that matter most to them? So Hannah Sistrunk, who's another person who's writing about archives and sort of theorizing it, she sees that there's optimal characteristics of archival interfaces in the digital era. She says to, quote, support multiple pathways into and through description in records, including people, organizations, and subjects, and multiple modes of inquiry, including by machines, by humans, and by machine-assisted humans. We should be encouraging and rewarding curiosity. And I end the quote. However, Devin Mordell and Ricky Puglazin note that despite the opportunities of interaction and experience design, online archival interfaces too often resemble a virtual version of the physical reading room, and users navigate the finding aid to arrive at an item description where they are then given a static digital representation for reading or reviewing. So Mitchell Whitelaw argues that search interfaces to archival collections should provide non-expert users of archives and collections with, he says the problem is that they provide non-expert users with a paltry and limited selection of contents. Instead, he advocates for this concept of the digital flaneur. And I know the flaneur is a very problematic concept, but nonetheless, it's interesting to see how he uses it, who is an individual or a group who needs and wants to explore online collections and archives drawn to the richness of virtual worlds. He has coined the term generous interfaces to suggest 5 principles that leverage his experience as an experience and visualization designer. And these are very succinctly: show first, don't ask. So volunteer rich information that supports an audience's understanding of the collection. Secondly, provide rich overviews, representative overviews of digital collections that characterize the collection as a whole and orientate the viewer and their experience. Thirdly, provide samples of primary content to represent and characterize a digital collection. Fourth, provide context. Display the structure and relationships within the collection to support interpretation. So he's a visualization guy, so this is part of how he sees doing that. And then share high quality primary content. So essentially provide seamless access to high quality primary content. So given these imperatives, it's valuable to consider an archive which supports research into the intersection of art, science, and technology. The Archive of Digital Art, ADA, which has documented the field of digital art since 1999, originally as the database of virtual art, which is now upgraded and integrated, and it includes artworks, curatorial aggregations, event documentation, and scholarly works. And what I think is very interesting is kind of like Rhizome, Rhizome is very aware of the technology it's using. I think with Ada, they're very aware of the interface they're designing. So it's really reflected in this statement. They said today's digital artworks are processual, ephemeral, interactive, multimedia based. Let's go there. Yay. Okay. Multimedia based. And fundamentally context dependent because of their different structures. So they require a modified or expanded concept of documentation. We ascribe high importance to artistic inventions like innovative interfaces, displays, or software. So they allow the user to really remix contents. You can construct your own notion of an archive. You can upload documentation of your work, including technical specifications, bibliographic records, associated reviews and discussions, papers, exhibitions, event and conference documentation. The homepage includes feature images from the archive that the user can explore and featured artists. And it includes the first of what will be a sequential online set of exhibitions, Coded Doc, remediated by Christine Paul. So it allows you to re-experience an exhibition that she had built as a physical and virtual exhibition at the New Museum. And it also has this thesaurus function, a word I don't say well, which is very exciting. And the idea of the thesaurus is that you can explore it hierarchically or as a word cloud. And they've chosen words that represent a kind of interface. So it's a way of searching the collection, right? Searching the archive. And they saw them as bridges between digital-born media art and traditional art forms, and also support the systemic analysis of, quote, important critical innovations, as well as the afterlife of historical themes in contemporary media art. So a strength of this is its discursive nature, and it has a lightbox tool where you can undertake image analysis and comparison for research. You can assemble visual arrangements from the extended documentation. You can add commentary. You can publish these for teaching or in sub-exhibition. So you can also join discussion groups. So this is really, I think, a really exemplary, representation of this idea of a generous interface. This is just a few stills from Ada. So digital artists are, very active in bringing together massive online databases and archives. And, okay, I'm a little bit out of order, so we're going to go here instead. Okay, we'll come back. So some digital artworks constitute archival interface design, whether operating as critical interventions into cyberculture or offering artist archives. So here I'm going to talk about an intervention to a museum. So I realize it's not an archive, but it has some great parallels. And so the award-winning Uncover Recover project was a collaboration with the Royal Ontario Museum, the ROM in Toronto, and OCAD University's Indigenous Visual Culture Program during Canada's sesquicentennial anniversary of Confederation. So it was funded by the Government of Ontario, and Bonnie Devine, who is the founding chair of INVC and a visual artist, and a group of students entered the ROM's vaults to uncover Indigenous artifacts, working with ROM and anthropology curators and Indigenous knowledge keepers and a large interdisciplinary team at the university. The students each chose an object that resonated with them, at times because it held symbolic, meaning to their family and personal history and or land. This is the team. And recovered its meaning. They took various trips to meet with Indigenous communities from whom objects were relevant within the museum, but at times because it held symbolic meaning to their family and personal history or land, and recovered its meaning, power, and presence in the contemporary world, giving it life and agency through digital reinterpretation. Through curriculum and research, the students learned about the provenance of the artifacts and their histories and mastered digital production. The processes were challenging, very challenging. A reminder that there are many other objects not recovered in the vaults of the ROM, and of the historical process of removing objects from communities. Each project was accompanied by documentation and an artist statement, which acts as its own rich interface to the collection, and then completed works were compiled for the ROM website by an Indigenous Media Art Collection, Mayengan Productions, and translations of text, and many of the student works are offered in Ojibwe, Cree, and some in Mohawk and Kanyakeha. So, it's a really important project, and an intervention like this has really pointed to the need for, quote, a decolonial perspective regarding collection interfaces, which, according to Clark and Segenthaler, quote, is not a counter perspective in the binary sense of the term. And I think this is very important what they're saying. It's not a binary counter perspective, but rather entails the complexities of plural ways of experiencing, knowing, and reasoning in the post-migratory world. And I end the quote. And I want to just take a second and go to the site. So the uncover part of the site is really about exploring, and the recover part of the site, kind of takes you through this process, and then allows you to see, the process in detail. And the videos included their trip to Manitoulin Island, the first visit to the ROM, activities within the classroom. And then when you click on a student, you are able to hear and see about their project. So here, we'll go to Mariah. So it provides you, in this instance, she was working with birch bark and a birch bark scroll. So it's really about the way that birch bark is a form of description and language, and the history of birch bark. And then she has a whole series here of stories that are told through these birch bark scrolls. So it's a very powerful project. I'm going to talk a little bit, I'm going to come back here and now talk about some other work. So in this instance, this is a project that I was very much involved with, and I'll just play. Okay, so Dr. Anna Joffrey and I developed the Tangible User Interface, which is a system that allows individuals or collaborating users to manipulate large quantities of data and produce comparative visualizations. So we did a big project with NLogic, who do a lot of media analytics work, looking at comparative viewership and audiences. And another, we worked with Time Magazine with their entire collection using browse and search interaction. And the tokens on the table represent components of the file structure, and you can move them collaboratively to analyze the archive and the database. The project's been used by, it's cheap, so you can build it, kind of DIY, and it's been used by libraries, teachers, and other kind of public entities who want to support collaborative visualization and digital fluency. Now going to the completely not cheap, Luc Courchain's Naked in Paradise is a virtual reality installation which contains his artworks over many decades, so artifacts and settings from everyday life organized in the past, present, and future. And he describes his archive in this way. He says, artists, whatever their creative medium, leave traces, artifacts, and eventually artworks which are representative of the processes that they engage with. And the VR interface is configured in real time along timelines and categories, but also other algorithms are generated by the computer through random constructions and keywords to reveal from the same assets very different geographies of one's time. So just a little bit of images from there. So May Chu, Susan Lord, and Janine Marchessault track the growth of community encounter archives that have grown in response to exclusion and misrepresentation by mainstream institutions. And the Krista Dahl Media Library and Archive at VIVO in Vancouver, the VIVO Media Arts Center, holds a significant repository of 8,000 video art, documentary, experimental documentary, narrative, synesthetic, animation, and event documentation videotapes by artists and independent producers representing 60 years of production, an extensive archive of publications from the video and media art world, as well as documentations of events, exhibitions, organizations, social movements, government policies, and the history of VIVO, which was founded in 1973. But over the last decade, it's expanded its efforts to create 15 special collections, as well as 9 major fonds and 5 minor fonds. It's developed finding aids and projects, including exhibitions building from the collections and artist residencies to interpret the collections. And they've raised money to digitize aspects of the archive and provide effective navigation interfaces. They work very closely with communities that are represented in the archives in the reinterpretation of this collection and in its energetic, and find energetic ways to build interfaces that are gateways. So in 2016, VIVO approached me to donate my materials to them for my early life as an artist, activist, and academic, and I was also a board member and curator and an artist with VIVO for many years. So I did. And my archive holds multiple sub-collections: the Women's Labor History Project, my personal video art and new media works, including the extensive Code Zebra project, Post-Internet Art Project, and it itself includes software, a website, performances, wearable arts, and artifacts. Amelia Productions, a 5-person feminist collective, 1980 to 1982, of which I was a member, and documents that I had in my possession, including regarding international solidarity, Indigenous rights, feminism, LGBTQ2+, feminist anti-censorship activities and records, labor activism, left-wing organizations, and curriculum development. So the documentaries of the Women's Labor History Project and our photographic and print exhibitions relied heavily on film, television, photographic, and institutional archives in Canada and BC. So components of the archive of the collection are archives of archives, and they kind of act as a way of understanding what was collected and what was absent. And in particular, the oral histories in the archive compensated for the very sparse records regarding women workers that were available in official archives. And my artwork are available on the site under a licensing agreement. So here you go. This is my fonds, and this is, I will talk about this in a moment. So this is a current exhibition using the fonds, and just a little bit more images. And then we're actually going to go here. Yeah, so here we go. So here's a sense of the collections, the major fonds. There's specialty finding aids. There's an Indigenous finding aid that's about to be published and will join these records. There's events with the archives as well, and I just want to go to projects here, so you can sort of have a sense of. So there's a lot of richness there, and the current exhibition is called "The Images Such as They Are Do Have an Effect on Us." unquote. And it's created by Hazel Mayer and Kate McKenney. And this title is a quote from Himani Banerjee's address at The Heat Is On, Women on Art and Sex, an anti-censorship conference held at Women in Focus in Vancouver in 1985 that I co-organized with Kara Knights and a group of other women. It's a mail art project, and it draws from my extensive collection of anti-censorship activities and debates about pornography, and VIVO's collections, including from Women in Focus, that it's essentially a debate between pro-censorship and anti-censorship feminism. And just to quote, in the 80s, many feminists opposed to porn drew on the language of gender violence to make their case, arguing that all sexually explicit images of women were harmful. Working against this position and the creep of censorship into smaller moving image formats in the province, queer and feminist artists defended sexual expression and created alternative visual languages for sex. Each side organized conferences and screenings, wrote position papers, protested, and kept making their work through it all. So the way that this works is that users sign up as an audience member. You sign up and you're mailed one of two dossiers. And one dossier represents the working files of an anti-porn feminist, and the other of an artist organizer involved in anti-censorship work. And some of the records are real, others are imagined, based on scraps, remnants, and gossip, and you get to navigate your way through these two different points of view. So Kara Knights created a permanent online exhibition, Women in West Coast Labor, 80 Years of Action for Equity in Domestic and Workplace Labor by Women in BC. And it has two sub-exhibitions in it. So one is the oral histories of the Women's Labor History Project and images. And a second, Working Women in Focus, presents the fonds of the Women in Focus Feminist Artist-Run Collective. And Knights saw relating these two fonds as a way to recognize the labor of both centers, Women in Focus and Women's Labor History Project, as a continuation of the struggles represented in the fonds. So she says these are two feminist-driven media groups with founding roots in the 70s who fought to break down barriers to access technology and represent the working lives of women. Their fight for gender equity in the field of media echo the experiences of previous generations of women whose testimonies live in these audio, video, and film recordings, end of quote. So bringing together interface activism and critical archival studies and the need for a platform that can be shared across archives and creators has become a goal of mine, and it coincides with the Crossing Fonds project in partnership with VIVO, the Krista Dell Media Library and Archives, SFU Archives, Library and Rare Books Collection, the Vancouver City Archives, Dr. Andia Fatona and her Center for the Study of the Black Canadian Diaspora, and Dana Claxton at UBC. So partner archives are going to examine the histories and methodologies that shape their institutions and fonds, and will make connections between historical and contemporary actors, including originating communities and individuals, to explore reinterpretation and redescription. So our methods to develop the bridge are highly collaborative and will include participatory design with user communities, this concept that Sabarwal has developed, which is of socialized digital curation. I love that notion. And also research creation and a case study approach. So we're already in the process of workshops to create the specifications for this ecosystem and develop microsites that will foreshadow the design. We're drawing from the power of artists' residencies and archives to have artists in archives workshops that are small residencies. And we're creating microsites that will sort of test the navigation strategies using these methods. And we're collaborating with local organizations, including BLAC, which is a Black-led artist-run center, and the Union of BC Indian Chiefs, and local Indigenous organizations to explore the archives and undertake metadata, annotation, redescription, and social media tagging to invoke new interpretations and readings of the archival material. We're also using visualizations to show relationships between fonds and metadata. And Andrea, Dana, Karen and I are leading the case study process in collaboration with archivists and community members. So I'm going to end shortly. So, there's promise for the future development of media art archives and their digital interfaces. Understanding the archive, as curator Christiane Paul states, as, quote, a living environment that can adapt to the mutable records it contains, unquote. She argues that an interdisciplinary and international approach needs to cohere around principles of interoperability of data collected on media and, quote, the creation of meta servers to share content. Haskaya, who's one of the people in the archive world who's sort of looking critically at some of the notions of interface design, suggested that vendors could bundle configurable and skinnable generous interfaces as part of collection management systems because few artist interfaces are scalable. Most arts-based research projects produce inventive and powerful tools to give access to specific pools of archive materials, but the problem is to scale these up to meet large volumes of diverse data. And there's this tension between standardization and customization. And future research could consider the ways that strategies such as ADAs and rhizomes might serve as examples that could be generalized while continuing to explore appropriate means to protect individual artists' unique interface contributions, perhaps within the interface. And to create truly accessible archives, we need to bring together the democratizing methodologies of critical archive studies, artists' experimental challenges to archival creation and navigation, and new forms of interface design. Thank you.